Shabbat Shalom. In the opening words of this week's Torah portion, we read, לדבר Elohim al Moshe, Vayomer elav ani Adonai. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. The verse poses a question for the rabbis. Why does the verse use two verbs? לדבר, meaning to speak, and lomar, meaning to say. The midrash tells us that the Hebrew verb meaning to speak implies that God's attribute of judgment and justice is coming into play. And that is why the name Elohim, one of God's names attributed to judgment, follows this verb, לדבר. But the rabbis teach us that the Hebrew verb meaning to say is related to God's trait of rachamim, of compassion. And that is why the verb is followed by another of God's names, Adonai. God has both of these characteristics, and in the various narratives of the Torah, we can see both compassion and justice on display. And this very short verse can inspire us to consider how we balance these two important and difficult characteristics, judgment and compassion. At times we're called upon to judge others, and yet we also must not ignore the call to have compassion for others. How do we know when to act the judge and when to allow compassion to well up in our hearts and pour out to others? This question highlights the tightrope that we all walk in our relationships with each other. Rarely do we find ourselves in a position where only one approach is what we're called upon to adopt. Rather, it's a careful, constant calibration of these two values that will best serve us. Even the best judges must at times exercise compassion in their rulings, and the most compassionate of people should not act without good judgment. As we walk through the world, may we look to God, to Judaism, and reflect deep within ourselves as we seek the balance of these two values in our everyday lives. When to speak and when to say, when to exercise judgment and when to show compassion. Shabbat Shalom.